The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions, gamers dominate the tabletop, and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Who sadly, once again, doesn't have a bit this week.
Dude! Okay, that's it. One more time, and you are fired. I'm totally replacing you with Pauly Shore.
Okay. I think Jack will be upset by that.
Okay, maybe I'll offer the job to Jack. We'll see. All right, and tonight we are going to be talking about comic books, a topic we've done a couple recent podcasts on, but tonight we're actually going to have some guests on, so it's not just us talking mindlessly about what stuff we don't know. Tonight we're talking about the American comic book industry, and to bring in an expert and returning guest, we've brought back Tim Finn, owner of Hub Comics from Somerville, Massachusetts. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Rob.
And with Tim is his manager of Hub Comics, Jesse Farrell. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right. So, Tim, tell us a little bit about Hub Comics. How long has it been running? Were you the original founder? What's the story here?
The store opened in early 2008, and the founding owner passed away unexpectedly in the spring of 2011. And Jesse reached out to me because he knew that I had been spending a lot of money here. And he said, hey, the family, the owner's family, is going to liquidate if we don't find a buyer. Do you want to buy the store? And I was quite busy with teaching and with writing and drawing. And I certainly didn't need a fourth job. So I said, probably. So over the summer of 2011, we rehabbed the store, although we never closed. We did all the paint and the moving of stuff while the store was open. And we had a big relaunch party in January of 2012, although we had been, open under my ownership since middle of 11. And since then, we have been selling lots of books and making friends and recommending a lot of books and interfacing with the community. Do you want to add something to that, Jesse?
We've been part of Union Square here in Somerville for 10 years, and it's been pretty great to... There are literally kids that I've seen grow up here. There are people who have met here and have now gotten married, and people are starting to have kids who met here. It's just kind of, I walk down the street and kind of know a lot of people in Union Square, and it's just great to be part of this community and bring them comic books. It's, it's nice to be the neighborhood comic shop. Well,
yeah, I bet it is. Now, Jesse, how long have you been involved with the store then?
I've been here since we opened in January of 2008, so just over 10 years now.
Jesse actually was with the store since November of 2007, a prehistory before the store was open, moving shelves and painting the first time. Right. So I inherited Jesse when I bought the store, which was great because he knew our POS system, our point of sale system. He knew the customers, he knew the neighborhood, and I was fortunate that our takes on comics and selling comics align. So we didn't have an adjustment period where one of us said, no, this kind of book doesn't sell, and the other said, oh, okay, we'll stop trying to sell that or order that. We already had very similar tastes, and we both like Star Trek, and we both like 80s cartoons, and so comic books is just in that continuum.
Right, right. Now, quick question. Could you tell us a little bit about Somerville, Massachusetts? Just for reference, what's the, town like? What are the demographics like? We'd like to know a little bit more about your customer base.
Somerville is 4 square miles, population 80,000. Mm-hmm. In the 50s, there was a Ford plant nearby in Somerville. That area is now an outdoor mall with, multiplex and like a Nike store and condos and apartments. Somerville has been traditionally...
When I was growing up, Somerville was not a great place to live. At least it had that reputation. And it's really developed and come into its own. There's a little bit of a growing pain that's happening right now where there are a lot of old Somerville residents and a lot of younger, lower income people even who are sort of being, I don't want to say gentrified because we're not quite there yet, but it's definitely like there's this divide between people who've lived here a long time and people who are moving in. It's becoming a very attractive neighborhood.
In the Somerville got a subway stop in the early 90s, and so we're on the Red Line in the MBTA, the Greater Boston subway system. And so you can take a subway train out of Boston and through Harvard Square and Cambridge, and 2 stops later is a very hip section of Somerville that's 2 miles away on the other side of the city. And when that subway stop came, that whole area, dive bars went away, and now it's coffee bars and great restaurants,
vape shops.
There's a vape shop in that section of Somerville, and
a poke restaurant.
Poke Works. Yep. And so we are kind of going to become that again in 2 or 5 or 10 years when we get right here next to the store a subway station. When the MBTA and the city and the state find $2 billion. But it is going to happen, and it's going to be wonderful because there'll be a second way to get into Boston. But it's going to continue this trend. And I should add, part of the great thing about a lot of this development, and Somerville has a lot of arts, by the way. It has a local arts council that works with the city government and also a lot of artists and puts on festivals and aligns with businesses. Part of the challenge for the city has been a tax challenge where the majority of the residents during the day leave Somerville to go work somewhere else, like Boston or the suburbs in their cars. And so Somerville has a lot more residents than it does business. And so there's less real estate tax than the city would like. And there's a lot of taxes that are being generated at like restaurants when people go get lunch at work outside of the city. And so the mayor's office has been trying to, in doing a lot of this development, increase the tax base to get that ratio more financially beneficial for the city. Because, more taxes means more recycling and cops and parks, and we have those things and we want more.
I can understand that. Now, how would you describe your average customer then? Like, who is the average customer for your shop?
I would say mostly young professionals in their 20s and early 30s. We also get a lot of families with kids. That's mostly it. I think that's our biggest demographic. But we have a really diverse clientele.
We're right next to, I shouldn't say we're right next to, a couple miles away is Tufts University, and we don't get a lot of college students because, amazingly, Somerville, in its 4 square miles, has another comic book store, which is closer to Tufts University. But with all of the universities in Cambridge and Boston and Charlestown and all the cities around Boston, you just sort of, you're always bumping into a college student or a grad student or someone who teaches. So we do have some students Um, we don't have, we tend not to have a lot of sort of back issue collectors because we're not really a back issue store. And we don't have people who are coming in and looking for a really valuable Silver Age or Golden Age comic. Like, oh, I need the third appearance of Superman, in mint condition. We don't sell that. The store looks like a bookstore because we have all these nice wooden bookcases, and most of the store is graphic novels with some single issue comics. But we look like a bookstore and not so much like a comic book store, which was by design.
And if I can add to that, I think we're a pretty friendly and approachable store to people who are not traditional comic book readers. And that has been a growing market. People who didn't grow up with comics, don't read superhero comics, are not the people that you immediately think of when you think of a comic book reader. And so we have a lot more people who come in to try their first comic here.
Yeah, one of the nice things about having so many comic book stores in the area, and I don't just mean the friendly competition 2 miles away, there are another 4 comic book stores within a 4-mile radius.
Wow.
And we will often send customers to those other stores if they come in on a Monday afternoon and are looking for a specific book that we don't have, because if they need that book today, someone else might have it in town. And if it's in print, we can get it in a week or two if that nice customer can wait. But these stores all have different sort of feelings and flavors, and I like that variety. When I was going to comic book stores in the 90s as a teenager, many of them were that stereotype of comic book store. It smells like paper. There's some grumbly dude behind the register. There may be like a kind of mopey younger dude who also works there. There aren't women customers. If you see a woman in the store, it may be someone's mom or girlfriend who's been dragged along and doesn't feel particularly welcome. And those stores tended to be lots and lots of issues and not so many books, so many graphic novels. Part of that is because the publishers hadn't gotten into the graphic novel market so much. So there just weren't a lot of graphic novels in print. But now, every story that's serialized in monthly issues 3 months later gets collected in a book with a spine. And that's the stuff that we lean more towards.
Okay. So I'm getting the idea then, because I used to work in a comic shop in the 90s, God help me.
He was the grumbly dude.
Yes, I was. And so I'm getting the impression what you're saying then is the people who come in are they're actually readers and not collectors or speculators then?
Yeah.
Okay, that's nice to hear, because like I say, back in the day, you mentioned it took the mainstream companies especially a long time to get into the graphic novels, and I think it was because they were worried at the time of making more instant collector's items, which would be typically the single issues, and it was because they weren't appealing to anybody who was reading them. They wanted people who would buy 10 and put 9 away.
There has been a startling and wonderful slow movement on the part of publishers that already made comics, publishers that didn't make comics but got into it. All the cottage industry of news and review websites and blogs. Culture has really caught up with this, where comics were for a more narrow band of the population in the 70s and 80s. And now in America, comics are for so many more people. And the big area of growth is the young adult market, kids in grade school and then middle school. And so much of that is Scholastic, which is, the largest educational publisher in America and the publisher of Harry Potter. But 11 or 12 years ago, they got into publishing graphic novels. And because of their book clubs at school, in schools, they have a direct line to all these new readers that, I'm going to criticize Marvel and DC lightly here, Marvel and DC were not doing the best job of courting in the last 15 years, although DC's got a new initiative that we're very excited about, and Marvel's always kind of playing some kind of catch-up.
I see. What's DC's new initiative that they're doing?
2 imprints. One is called DC Ink, and one is that's INK, and one is called DC Zoom. And I forget the precise years. One's for
young readers and one's for middle grade, I think.
Yeah, and middle grade I think is defined 11 to 13 in America. So let's say it's roughly 7 to 10. That's an age, not grades, and then 11 to 13. And earlier this year, DC had a big unveiling of the first wave of these graphic novels. They're not single issues that are going to be collected into books. They're just original graphic novels, and the trim size is smaller, like Bone, like Amulet, like Smile, like Sisters. And DC's big unveiling of these was at the American Library Association conference. It was not at a comic book convention. And librarians have figured this out in the last 2, 5, 10 years because they are on the front lines of getting kids to read, because they see kids every day, every week, and the books are free. Whereas, we see kids when it's a treat, or when they're like, they've put their name to get into the restaurant down the street and they've got a half hour to kill. Like, kids, let's go in the comic book store and maybe we'll buy something.
Sort of tying into that, do you find that when you get like the younger people in the store, is it a multi-generational thing, or do the parents aren't not or were not comic readers, the kids are doing it of their own volition?
That's a great question. I think it varies. We definitely have some parents who are bringing their kids in and then get themselves a big stack of graphic novels also. But I think there are also a lot of parents who come in expressly for their kids, which is kind of new, where the parents missed comics entirely and are just getting books for their kids.
Have we seen any, Jesse? Have we seen any instances where the parent is not into comics and slowly, because the kid is getting them, the parent kind of gets into them? Do you see that? Jesse's here more often than I am.
I think so, yeah. Although I wouldn't say definitively, but that's not something I see a lot. But yes, I think that is something that's happened, yeah.
Now, question then. I've heard anecdotal stories of, parents coming into comic book stores and after, watching the Marvel movies, and they want to show their kids like, oh, this is, Captain America that I grew up with and everything like that. But they're finding that the current comic books are not, like the movies anymore. They're not like the traditional characters anymore. Do you have those kind of situations come up where you have to explain to them, well, no, this is the new Captain America, or things like that? Or how do you handle this?
The thing that happens most often is parents are looking for books for their kids, having seen the movies, and the comics are not necessarily age appropriate. For example, the other day there was a woman who came in who had a kid who was, I would say, 5 or 6, and he was really excited about Black Panther. And Marvel put out one digest-sized Black Panther comic, which is now out of print. So
I think it just came back into print.
Okay.
So I think it was out of print for 2 months. I think we couldn't get it for a little while.
He'll be thrilled. So what I've been doing for this mom is flipping through issues of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Brian Stelfree's Black Panther run, which is very good, but very much for adults. And I don't mean necessarily even that it's too racy. It's just that it's for adults in the sense that it's very talky. There is not a lot of action. It's good, it's thoughtful, it's smart, but it's not a book that a kid wants. And I feel like that's leaving money on the table, not having something that a kid who wants to read a Black Panther comic could read.
This has gotten better in even the last 2 months. Marvel has rolled out 2 miniseries in the last, I guess, 3 months. One is Marvel Superhero Adventures, where they're drawn with big heads and they're kind of cartoony. If you remember Rescue Heroes, all those action figure lines from 5-10 years ago, it looks a little like that. So they're in a couple issues of that, and the new one thankfully has Venom and Spider-Man on the cover, so all these kids who see the trailer for this PG-13 Venom movie that is not appropriate. I mean, I don't mean 10-year-old kids. I mean 5-year-old kids, where it's not appropriate.
Yeah.
You know, as of 3 weeks ago, we can sell them this one Venom comic. And there's an animated film that's going to run on, I think, Disney or Disney XD around this week called Marvel Rising, which is aimed at, 6 to 10-year-olds, and it's several new Marvel characters from the last couple years, and many of them, most of them actually on this sort of impromptu team, are female. And so this is a sort of a subtle way of directing that at, again, an audience that, most of the Marvel characters are male, and we're still waiting for our first female lead Marvel movie. So there have been some tie-in issues this summer with Marvel Rising, and they look really sharp.
Right.
Going back to your actual question, if the comics don't look like the movies, we have two responses. One is, because we are so much more of a graphic novel store, we likely have in stock the book from 2 or 15 or 30 years ago that the movie is referencing.
Right.
And so if right now, a version of a Marvel character is a different character, or is dead, or a robot, or a zombie, or their sidekick is actually in the costume being called by the hero's name, if someone picks up that new issue and it doesn't make sense, for several reasons, we're happy to divert them to a collection of issues from 10 years ago. One, that whole story might be more satisfying than just 20 pages of the current story. Two, we can sell them something that's more expensive, for us, I mean. And three, by walking them over to where the graphic novels are and pointing out a couple key books, or, oh, well, if you like this, you might try this. It's just easier to do that standing in front of our Marvel section or our DC section, which is pretty robust. If you're looking at our new comics section, we don't have the space to carry every new issue of every series because there are hundreds and thousands of them. So we're happy to, if someone wants to know about, Black Widow, there's a really good Black Widow miniseries. Actually, there are two really good Black Widow miniseries that are packaged together in a book called Itsy Bitsy Spider from 2003, roughly. And it's good spy action adventure, and it's, PG-13. And they'll get 2 complete stories out of that if they really like this one character from the movies and want to know, what else. Because at the moment, this month, there's not a Black Widow series running. That's a character where right now Marvel's doing sort of a mini series or a special like every 6 months or a year, but maybe she doesn't have enough sales clout to sustain an ongoing monthly.
The comics are the media adaptations of comics are always going to be different. To use another example, when The Walking Dead was really at its height on TV, I would have people come in and say, "Can you show me which book starts after the episode I just watched?" And I'd have to tell people, well, it doesn't work like that. It's not a one-to-one adaptation. Some of the characters are the same, some of them are different. Comic book storylines are always a moving target. They never stop. The train never stops. There kind of is no golden era where your character was exactly preserved in amber. That kind of doesn't happen. So you're just trying to find kind of best averages, I guess, of well, here's this Captain America story was great. This is this other run.
There are some examples, and those are freestanding adaptations. So V for Vendetta, Watchmen, Scott Pilgrim is 6 books, not 1, but it's only 6 books. And, that movie really is 5.5 of those books. So in a few cases, we can point someone to the thing that is most like the thing they're remembering. Very occasionally, there might be a challenge. I don't know if we've ever had anyone come in and ask about Daniel Clow's Art School Confidential.
Never.
Okay, so I don't love that movie. I think it was a good idea, but I don't love the movie. It's based on a 3-page comic, and you can't buy those 3 pages by themselves. They're collected in a book. But if someone is interested in that, then we just need to have a larger discussion, me and the customer, about Daniel Clowes, which I'm happy to do, standing in front of the 10 Daniel Clowes books that we have in our Daniel Clowes section.
We have had people come in to ask about Ghost World, which is collected in one book.
Yes. Yes, we occasionally but regularly sell the soft cover of Ghost World.
Right. Huh. Actually, going back to what you were just saying, okay, so you were saying that Marvel's got, of course, they're doing their push towards female readership and such. Have you seen an actual increase in female readers over the last, 10 years or so? Has it actually made a difference?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know how typical our store is, but I think our clientele is 50-50 men and women. And a lot of the Marvel female-led books are absolutely bringing in women readers. Captain Marvel, absolutely unbeatable Squirrel Girl, Ms. Marvel, to a lesser extent, She-Hulk and Hellcat. But yeah, no, it's and right now Runaways, which is I would say a mostly female team, it has had kind of a bump up recently.
Yeah, a sort of more general question that I think you might be asking without asking is, when a movie or a TV show of one of these properties hits, do we see a sales spike for that book? Are more people asking about it? And the answer is a little. When the first Thor movie was released and when the second Thor movie was released, I think each time I made a little display of Thor books. And I think between those two movies and, 3 or 4 weeks total between the two movies, I think we sold one extra Thor book. And, surprisingly, during this currently still continuing run by a writer named Jason Aaron, his Thor book has gone through several changes. The title has changed and the numbering has restarted and the main character has changed. But for a year and a half in there, Thor was the Thor that we know, the male big guy with blonde hair. He was not Thor. Someone else was Thor, and she was a woman, and sales went up. And we have a much harder time selling a Thor book, from the Walter Simonson run from the 1980s or the Dan Jurgens and John Romita Jr. run from, what was that, mid-90s. We sell more of what we, I think, lovingly call Lady Thor. That's not the actual title. We sell more of that than all the other Thors, even though sort of it's all one story going back to 1963, and it's all one story by this one writer in the last 3 or 4 years. But I do think some of this goes back to our store is welcoming. I don't even want to say to women, because I think that's putting too fine a point on it. We're a store when we welcome readers and we welcome, when someone says, I've got a dumb question, I say, great, I love dumb questions because they've got easy answers. But usually that means that someone wants to spend a few minutes and ask about books. And all of our employees, Jesse, Dave, Juliet, and Jack, who was here for 7 years and just moved on to a wonderful new job. All of the employees here are good at recommending books and interfacing with the customer, superhero stuff or not. Someone came in last week and asked about comic books featuring cats. I don't mean the Broadway musical. I mean the species. And Jesse and I sort of scratched our head each for a moment, and then we each sort of leapt into action. So there's this manga called
Junji Ito's Cat Diary.
Right, so Junji Ito is the writer-artist, and he's made these comics about his cats. And then there's a different manga,
She's Sweet Home,
which is really cute and looks like it's for kids, but it's for everyone. I was unhelpful, and I volunteered Garfield because we have 7 Garfield collections in the humor section, which is half genuine and half sort of smugly ironic because it's Garfield. And then
kids love Garfield.
And then we came up with one more, right?
Well, you just had that idea for the Cats musical adaptation, comic book adaptation, which I think is I think you got something there.
Which publisher is going to license this?
IDW.
And I think there was one more that we were sort of hovering around. But I mean, that's an unusual request. Usually, someone is asking you.
Can I stop you there? I can explain it actually where it came from. My niece is devourer. That's the correct word of a series of books called they're called the Guardians books, which are basically all about these tribes of cats that live in a forest and have like fantasy adventures and such. And they're not anthropomorphic; they're regular cats, as far as I can tell, anyway.
Is that warriors?
There's that too. There's guardians, there's warriors, there's a whole bunch of them.
You know, I'm gonna step in here and I'm gonna admit something that's embarrassing. I think a publisher may have done comics adaptations of a few of these, and we don't have them. And a decision that I made early on with the store, we're a pretty big space compared to many stores. We're just over 1,000 square feet. There are stores that are further out from a city center, and you know their rent is low, and they just have space for tables of back issues or tables for Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop gaming. And there are some really wonderful hole in the wall stores, in cities or strip malls, and I love all of these. When I travel, I go to comic book stores. But a decision that I made early on, and Jesse was on board, was we're going to curate. We don't have the space to have everything. And if we max out and have sort of one copy of everything we can have space for, there's a little bit of visual clutter. The store can feel overwhelming. And a couple customers have very nicely described this to us. And just imagine if you're looking at a bookshelf in a bookstore and you reduce the number of copies, you take half the books off the shelf and you double the number of copies of all the books that are still there. You've instantly simplified the view, right? There are fewer different things, and it can be more inviting. Now, we're still totally happy to have a conversation and make recommendations. Someone says, I like this TV show. What comic should I read? My favorite game is when someone really vaguely remembers something about a comic. And if you tell it, is there a dominant color on the cover? Do you remember a name? Is there a general theme? And I was at our friendly competition last week, and a customer, because I was looking for a couple things that maybe they had that we need, that are out of print, and maybe they'd cut me a deal, and they did. And the owner came up to me and he said, Tim, do you know, I'm going to jump to the end because I actually can't remember. So the owner of the friendly competition said, Tim, do you know a book? There was a long delay. It's about a video game. And my brain started flipping through our sort of recent comics bin, and I saw the white border and the block font on the top, and I saw two words or compound noun, and the second one was player. And I said, oh, is this the last couple years? There was an issue, and then a couple years went by, and there's a second issue, and the third issue's not coming out for a while. And the customer, his face just drooped. And I said, non-player. And the guy said, that's it. I said, yeah, sorry. I think the writer-artist has a day job, and I think it's going to be a couple years before he does the third issue. Thinking back to when Jesse, my manager, said this to me 2 years ago, disappointed because he really wants to read what happens next. So, but sometimes someone comes in and says, I like Law and Order, or I like The Wire, or I like Breaking Bad. And there's never precisely a comic like that, but there's often something close enough that we can put out a couple, someone who likes that, we'll show them
Gotham Central,
which is the beat comic about the 3 shifts that police officers are working in Gotham City, and Batman is barely in this book. And all the scenes on the TV show Gotham that deal with the cops are sort of inspired from this comic, even if there's no direct adaptation. And then there's a series called Criminal. And then I can pull out other works by the writer and artist who did Criminal, because they've collaborated on a bunch of different things. So, if someone's not in a hurry, if they've got 5 minutes to get some recommendations, we're kind of like a sommelier.
That's very nice.
Did I say that right?
Yes.
Because comics really are a fine wine. They can appreciate with age. You might want to savor them. You might want to display them or encase them carefully. They can spoil.
What comic would you recommend go with a fine brie?
Garfield.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Garfield.
yeah,
Garfield. Because he's just gonna, that drawing where,
everything.
that drawing where he's just devouring lasagna and his arms are drawn several times and his mouth is open and his head is cocked back. I just imagine him doing that with a fine brie.
Okay, so one other question. So what ratio would you say you have of like American comics and foreign comics? Not just Japanese, of course. There's also European as well and others.
That's a good question. I would say we're predominantly American comics. There's a growing market of translated European comics that are coming over. They're just now collecting some of Mobius's work in nice hardcovers that have been out of print for many years. We do have a sizable manga section. That's probably the biggest concentration of foreign language, originally in a foreign language books.
If you want numbers, very roughly, it's probably 70% is single issues and graphic novels of American comics, and then 5% is art books like Understanding Comics or The Art of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and then 10 or 15% is manga. I'm just sort of looking at our shelves, and then 5%. Not even in its own section, but scattered in a couple of our genre sections, because some are fantasy and some are sci-fi, would be stuff from Europe. It's only been the last 2 or 4 years that maybe 3 publishers, I guess Titan, Dark Horse, and IDW, and then I guess Lionforge has sort of come out of nowhere to translate or print stuff from Europe. It's only in the last few years that a few publishers have stepped up to really do this. And in the 80s, the only foreign comics were, in the mid 80s, is it Barefoot Jen or Barefoot Gan?
Oh, yeah, Barefoot Gan, yeah.
So, it's like volunteers that were, it was almost bootleg. Project Gan was publishing, Jen?
I don't know if it's Gan or Jen.
How embarrassing. A comic from Japan, but that has since been repackaged and like properly published and translated. And then Marvel picked up Akira, but part of Marvel picking up Akira was that Akira, sort of out of all the Japanese comics, sort of most looked and felt like American comics.
Yes,
I mean, there's stuff in there that's really Japanese culturally, but it's not a romance comic. It's not a comic about teenagers playing tennis and one of them falling in love, right? Like that's not going to sell in the 80s in America. Maybe in the 50s.
There aren't. Akira doesn't have a lot of stylistic tics that are unique to Japan. Right? It was a pretty easy, visually a pretty easy translation to me.
Yeah. And then in the late 80s, Marvel, through its Epic imprint, was doing Mobius, a bunch of Mobius work. And then, lost the license, and for many years you could get almost nothing from Mobius in America, and that changed just a year or two ago.
In the periphery of comics publishing throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you always had Heavy Metal Magazine, which was mostly European content translated, and Tintin and Asterix, which were kids books, and I think a lot of people weren't even aware of. I think most people probably had some idea that these aren't American.
Yeah, they're also,
but they were so ubiquitous. Like all classrooms had.
Yeah, it's interesting you say. It's interesting you say all classrooms, because a lot of comic book stores don't have Tintin or Asterix, and part of that is the publishers are, for lack of a better word, regular book publishers. It's not comics publishers that are publishing those in America. You can, if you're a comic book store, you can order them from Diamond, from the big sort of, it's not legally a monopoly, but it sure feels like a monopoly. from the big monopolistic distributor that services all the comic book stores in America and around the world. You can get Asterix and Tintin from them, but they don't grab a lot of attention in the catalog. If they go out of stock, they're not restocked very quickly. And if you're thinking about Batman and Watchmen and Mouse and Persepolis, that stuff may just be on the periphery. It's like you could have a conversation with someone for an hour about The Simpsons and forget to talk about Futurama, even though that's so related. There are all these Venn diagrams, and there are lots of things to, and I say this innocently, sort of to forget about, or it's like, oh, we're going to get around to that. Part of why we can carry such a good variety is that we order our comics from 4 different distributors, and then we have an independent sales agent who lives in New York who he contacts comic book stores, and he gets stuff from individuals who self-publish, and then from some of these, quote, regular book publishers that want to get more into the comic book store market. So every Monday, we are doing a reorder. We are placing a reorder with Diamond for, regular stuff. Like, we sold a Superman book last week, so we're going to reorder it, and it'll come back in 2 weeks. And at the end of the month, we do our sort of big order for everything coming out in 2 months from Diamond. So that's 5 orders a month that we just cycle. But every Monday or Tuesday, I do an order from Baker and Taylor, and they're a, quote, regular book distributor. So, Stephen King novels and the Bible and cookbooks, we could order those. They won't sell, but we can get sort of any book that's in print. But I'm interested in that distributor because they carry Andrews and McMeel, and that's Calvin and Hobbes.
Oh, okay.
And they always have at least 1 copy in stock of the first 3 Calvin and Hobbes books, whereas Diamond, which is the exclusive distributor for the major publishers, Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse, Boom, 2 or 3 others, Diamond's primary goal is not to carry Calvin and Hobbes. Diamond's primary goal is to carry Spider-Man. And I don't say that critically. That's just how the business is. It's like you go to a gas station and you want gas, but they may not carry your brand of cigarettes, right? Or gum, whatever.
Right. And it's pretty unusual for comic shops to have that many distributors that they use. Most comic shops in North America, I would say, only go through Diamond.
Or if they have a secondary source, I don't think they're doing orders as often as we are. Or if it's a secondary source, it's for toys or for games, because there are distributors for those items as well, and we don't carry those.
We should mention, we are a comic book store. We don't carry toys and games, which is again in this market a little bit unusual.
Yeah, and we both love toys. Jesse and I both love toys and games. I'm writing a book about toys, and sometimes I talk to Jesse about Fireball Island. And one day we're going to sit down and play it, and then with that Kickstarter for the new one, we'll sit down and play the new one, and then Jesse will understand Fireball Island.
I love Hungry Hungry Hippos as much as the next guy, but
in this store we want to do 1 or 2 things really well, and partly the 4 or 5 of us who are here, I could sell Dungeons and Dragons, but not very well. I haven't played it in a long time, and that takes up space. So we just wanted to focus. We have a few T-shirts. We sell bags and boards and boxes, supplies for comics. We have a few posters, but not a great way to display them. So they don't sell as often as we'd like. But if you like Neil Gaiman because you watched American Gods, or you read the Graveyard Book, or you saw Coraline, or you just love The Sandman, we have, I'm going to use a library term, we have I think 45 linear inches of Neil Gaiman. That's books spine out, not face out.
Wow.
We have two shelves. We have everything that Neil Gaiman has written that's in print, not audiobooks, not books on CD. But his children's books, the book he co-wrote with Terry Pratchett, the comics he's written, the novels he's written, everything in print that we can carry from Neil Gaiman we have, because that's a devoted fan base, and often someone who's read Sandman wants to read more, or
the other way around, someone who's read American Gods. Oh, he wrote comics? Yes, he did.
Yes, here's the one Batman story that Neil Gaiman wrote. Or, do you want every DC comic that Neil Gaiman wrote that's not Sandman all in one book? Because we have that now. The DC Universe by Neil Gaiman. Softcover.
You guys have kind of hit on something that I'm wondering, because I'm old. Like, me and Rob are both in our late 40s. And I can remember back in the day when it came to comic books and comic book stores, in the minds of the fans and the minds of the public, there was a very tight definition of what a comic book was. That was a superhero. And a very tight definition of who read them. That was the guys in The Big Bang Theory. And I'm wondering, do you find that there's still this narrow image of what comic books are, or do you find that that's expanding?
I think it's absolutely expanding. One of the things I found very interesting, because I grew up around here where we have a lot of comic shops and there are a lot of comic readers. Most of the readers that I knew that are sort of our age, they may have started with superheroes and then their taste expanded. But what I'm finding is that a lot of people who are reading comics now, who are in their 20s and early 30s, they may have skipped superheroes entirely. They may have never read superhero comics. They may have come in through manga. They may have just started reading comics because someone recommended Saga to them. It's definitely changing. I think it has changed. I think the stereotype comic fan absolutely still exists, but in increasingly small numbers. I think there's a great thing that the guy who brings us our comics every week said. He compared the current comics market to television. He said it used to be the television, you had 5 channels and every show tens of millions of people watched, even the lowest rated show. Now you have 500 channels and you may only have a few 100,000 people or even a few thousand people watching a show, but we have so many more shows and they're so much better than they used to be. So it's a bigger pie, but it might be cut smaller.
In terms of that sort of reader that we might remember from the 80s and 90s, that fan, and sort of what a comic book was, another aspect of the store and also our city is local comics, self-published comics. Sometimes what we call mini comics, and mini comics, that term is both imprecise and precise. If you imagine a piece of paper from your printer, it's 8.5 by 11, and you fold it in half and you turn it sideways. So that's the most common size of a mini comic, but that term also means any homemade or small press homemade comic. It might be self-distributed. It might be, I mean, you might print it on your printer at home, so it's not literally homemade. You didn't make it, you're not printing it with a brayer and ink yourself. But you take it to a print shop, you take it to a photocopy place like what used to be called Kinko's and is now FedEx office. You go to Staples and you go to their copy center, you steal copies at your local university or library. You staple it yourself, you make 30 or 300, you sell them, and we carry that because there are people, partly because we have a lot of art schools in Greater Boston, and a lot of people who read this stuff tend to be in that age anyway. Boston has a major comic book convention that's named for the city, Boston Comic-Con, but Boston also, and then smaller regional shows, every 3 or 4 or 5 weeks around Boston. But Boston, I should say, Cambridge, right, which borders Boston and which borders Somerville. So 1.5 miles from the store, there's an art school LA plus D. This is the art school at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And once a year they host MICE, which is the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo. And MICE is run by the Boston Comics Roundtable, which is I think they're a nonprofit, which is an organization of, and a couple of the people who are the Boston Comics Roundtable shop at the store and are friends of the store. But they have weekly meetings, and if you want to make comics and get advice, you can go to the meetings. They put on this show, and it is a comic book convention, but it's all for people who make their own comics. And it's a lot of students and a lot of people in their 20s. And if you know of this sort of network of similar shows, there's SPX, that's Small Press Expo, that's in Maryland. There's APE, Alternative Press Expo, that's in Portland?
Portland, I want to say it's in Portland.
There's what's the one in Staple
in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, there are 10 or 15 of these shows, and they're scattered throughout the year, and they don't make the news the way that San Diego does, because it's not 200,000, or New York, it's not 200,000 people, and there's not cosplay, and the movie studios are not there trotting out the new thing. But there is so much passion and great artistry. So we have a local comics section, and we have some customers who are not interested in superhero comics, and maybe they've seen the superhero movies or maybe not, but they come here for stuff in the local section. They come here for work published by Fantagraphics or Drawn and Quarterly, or publishers that are releasing work by cartoonists and auteurs. So not the assembly line of Marvel and DC where one person writes it and one person draws it, and Peter Parker has been 29 since, well, right. I mean, at the beginning he was 15, but Peter Parker has aged from 15 to 29 over the course of 50 years. And then every few years they sort of reset things. There are some people who that's not their bag. And, whether it's From Hell or Persepolis or Fun Home, we sell a lot of that stuff. And it's actually a lot easier to sell that stuff, sort of by volume. Tonight in this conversation, we've talked a lot about Marvel and DC and superhero movies, but we sell a copy of Fun Home or Mouse or Persepolis. And by the way, one of those got turned into a movie, and one of those did get turned into a Broadway musical, which was amazing. We sell a copy of one of those three books at least once a week. And oftentimes we'll sell two of those three books within a week's time. And, when someone is interested in Spider-Man, where do they start? Do they read the book that has the earliest stories, which are fun but a little clunky and old-fashioned? Do they read the story that the current movie is most like, or the current...
But he's out of continuity and doesn't quote-unquote count anymore?
Yeah, it's like, well, do you have the story where he dies? It's in the future. Do you have the story where he's not there, but the black Puerto Rican kid is Spider-Man now, and he's going to get a movie? But, someone comes in, and what this really is, people want stories. Yeah. And you use that term, readers instead of collectors. And some customers are really into something like Sandman or Saga or Criminal, where it's 5 or 10 or 20 volumes and then it's over. Spider-Man's forever, and Batman's forever. Yeah. And if you want like sort of an old-fashioned 80s story that's a little dark, I can find that Batman story for you. And if you want the really dark story from last year, we've got that. And if you want some lighthearted Batman stuff from the 50s, or that's like the show from the 60s, we've got those. But again, where do you start and where do you end? And since you can't really end, it may not be satisfying. But, someone comes in and they want to read John Lewis's March, right? Autobiographical. It's very of the moment right now, civil rights. It's, written by a living, sitting representative in Congress. It's drawn really well. So many kids are reading this book. It's winning, I should say books, because it's a trilogy. And the sequel is coming out very soon. We're very excited. It's called Run.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than marching for rights, it's about running for Congress. But even though we have a lot of space devoted to Marvel and DC and sci-fi and fantasy, more of our customers are interested in our nonfiction section and our what we call alternative section, and probably the best word for that is drama.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like those are the that and books for kids are the growth areas. We still have a lot of everything. I mean, that's one of the things I pride us on is that we have something for every taste.
Right.
And I love genre stuff. I love superhero comics. I love sci-fi comics. But it's also great that we have something for people who are not geeks like me.
And we have comics. We have comics for 5-year-olds, not Black Panther comics necessarily.
Found that out the hard way.
There's a wonderful publisher out of New York called Toon Books. They just celebrated their 10th anniversary. They're not on a lot of people's radar because they publish selectively, only a couple books a year, and there are these gorgeously designed hardcovers, and which then go to softcover. And there's a whole variety. They're little kid comics, and they're written and drawn carefully. And the editor is Françoise Mouly, who has been in comics since the 70s, and she's also the art director of The New Yorker. And I've listened to her speak at 2 different conventions, and I just want to curl up in a transcript of her remarks. And Toon Books, each of them it's really short. It's like 20 pages. Some of them are about people. Some are about cute anthropomorphic animals. Some of them are about monsters. But they are tiered for kindergartners through 3rd graders. And on the back of each book, it says level 1, 2, or 3. And on the inside back cover, it explains what each of those means, sort of how many words are in the book, how long the sentences are, sort of how hefty the concepts are. And so people come in, sometimes a mom or a dad or an aunt or an uncle comes in with 3 kids. And it's a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old and a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old. And clearly the 10-year-old and the 8-year-old have a lot to look at, and they'll find something. And a couple times I've said, oh, is your youngest also interested in comics? I mean, certainly there are picture books and board books for 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. Not so much comics until this publisher, but we have books that are, clearly labeled, though not in an aesthetically unpleasing way. This is a wonderful book for a 5-year-old, and so we gave that publisher its own section. And I think every day we lead someone over, because maybe their kid wanders over to where Spider-Man is in the Marvel section, and that stuff is all sort of PG or PG-13, and they can just look at the pictures. There may be a lot of words that they're not going to follow, but something that they can actually fall into, that a parent can read to them, that's sort of developmentally age appropriate. We love connecting readers with those kinds of books,
because that's where comics readers are going to come from in the future.
Yeah, right. we're not worried about 40 and 50 and 60-year-olds. We will sell them books, and they're great. But they've already been convinced that comics are great.
Right.
Oh, man, you guys are going to make me cry because you're taking me back to the days of my youth.
Also, you guys should come to the store, and there's nice restaurants nearby, and then we could go to some of the other stores, or you could go to some other stores.
You're sending them to the competition.
Well, no, what I mean is for a pleasant comparison.
Right. Well, my wife keeps bugging me to go down to Boston and head down that way, so maybe we'll drop by sometime, maybe next year, and we'll have dinner together.
That sounds
good.
Yep. Question then. Okay, so it sounds like you guys have spent a lot of effort interacting with fans and comic book fandom and trying your best to develop. Do you have any comic club or anything like that at your actual store?
There's a wonderful store in San Francisco that has a monthly book club I have thought of doing something like that. I have these other jobs, I teach and I write, and the store takes a lot of time. So that may be one of those things that is on the list of wonderful things that we would like to do someday.
Yeah, I would say not officially, but on any given Wednesday, you're gonna hear a lot of spirited discussion from people who are in the store.
Is what you mean is you and a few regular customers?
Yeah, and anyone who just happens to wander in and has an opinion that they want to weigh in on, and I like to think that we're pretty open to, if people feeling as though they can jump in on these discussions, but yeah, so nothing official, but I feel like any comic shop with some floor space is going to have some kind of comics discussion club, some kind of impromptu comics discussion club that develops.
Yeah, and to probably disappoint some of your listeners, we don't offer e-commerce. We have a website at hubcomics.com, and we're on Facebooks, /hubcomics, and Instagram at hubcomics. Our Instagram's great. Juliet's great.
Juliet, yeah.
Taking photos, and sometimes on Tuesdays we post little 1-minute movies that are like ads. But
Juliet is the youngest one of our staff, and she's cooler than all of us, so she knows how to run the Instagram. Yeah.
But unfortunately, we don't sell books over a website through the internet, and we don't have an eBay store. A little of that is me being old-fashioned because I'm doing finger quotes here, just being a bookstore. We're also a little late to that party. There's certainly big websites that do that, and a lot of, medium and small size stores that do that. That also takes a lot of time to do well, and I don't want to do something if we can't do it really well. One of the stores in the area has an eBay store, and I see one of those employees at the post office pretty regularly with a stack of packages mailing out an issue or a book, and that's amazing that they can offer that, and that's a great revenue stream. We are satisfied with customers coming in and browsing. Right now Jesse and I are sitting on one of our 2 couches. The store has couches, and we to a reasonable degree welcome people to sit for a bit and look at a book.
You're welcome to browse. Please do not read all of Watchmen. That has happened before. We had to talk to that guy. So every day, just come in, read a chapter. I'm like, maybe buy the book.
So there's that joke, hey kid, this ain't a library. And we've never said that. Though if I did, I would do it like a stereotype of some cranky 80s newsstand agent. Hey kid, this ain't a library.
And in fact, there's a library up the street that has a great comic selection.
Yes, and partly they have a great comic selection because we gave them 200 graphic novels. I should say they already had a very good selection. We made friends with the librarian, and again, we want to cultivate readers. And up the street next to the library is the high school, and if those kids are walking 500 feet to get a book out of the library, and someone says, well, down the street there's the store, and we can read the next book, buy the next book.
Right. Hopefully buy. Now,
it's an ecosystem.
Yeah, and you're definitely cultivating that ecosystem and doing a great job of it from the sounds of it. Actually, here's a question then, since we're on topic of fandom. So, thanks mostly to the internet, fandom has become a little bit more radical in the last couple years. Have you guys found that affecting your store at all, or your business?
No, it hasn't. I see it online. And I for some reason we are mercifully spared from this, but it's gotten really contentious. I tend to think a lot of the people who are most agitated and most upset about the state of comic books actually don't read comic books and haven't for many years. And I'm judging this by sort of what they say about comic books. I feel like, you don't actually read. They're usually, it seems to me, just kind of at a glance, that mostly they're responding to things being different from when they were a kid. And it's like, well, that's because it's been 15, 20 years since you've read a comic book, and they have moved on.
Yep.
And that's the nature of serialized fiction. Yeah, that's.
I think so. I agree. I think it's a big part of it.
Oh, I was gonna say, when you mention that, because I can remember, say, back in the '80s, there was a lot of contention between the independent fans and like the superhero mainstream fans. You get to the end of the '90s, the superhero guys are kind of getting squeezed out by the Japanese stuff, and there's a lot of contention. Do you find there's any kind of like fan group rivalry going on now?
No, I think they mostly leave each other alone now. I think there's so much crossover. I mean, there are some people who are just dedicated to kind of one type of thing or another, but for the most part, there just sort of isn't a lot of cross-pollination or a lot of awareness. If you are only reading autobio comics, you probably don't know what's going on in the new issue of The Wicked and the Divine, and that's fine.
Also, your question in terms of in the store, no, we don't see any friction. In terms of sort of online, we're reading comic book news, and Jesse's on Twitter.
Yep.
I have a Facebook page, but I'm not so much on social media. So some of what we hear or learn is secondhand. But I think going back to the analogy that Jesse used from the guy who delivers our comics every week, who brings us our UPS boxes of comics, there are all to go back to the sort of cable TV example and 500 channels, you don't need to worry about what's happening with that other kind of comic because there are so many comics for you.
Yeah, it's not like one thing is crowding out another thing anymore.
Yeah. I mean, maybe in 1989 it felt like, like manga was pushing superhero comics out of the way, but you go to a convention and it's all there. And if it's not there, like you go to a major sort of, mainstream superhero and genre convention, and if there isn't a lot of self-published autobio comics, then you go to the small self-published autobio comics convention, and that it's like, well, I like gluten-free. Well, I'm going to go to this gluten-free bakery and feast on this cake. And I don't have to worry about the supermarket sheet cake.
For a couple of years, we this was before Tim bought the shop. We had a table at Anime Con, which is an annual event in Boston.
Anime
Boston. Sorry, yeah. And I found it interesting because I didn't know. I know manga a little bit, but I don't know a tremendous amount of anime, and it was an entirely different fan culture than I was used to. It didn't bother me that these kids, how come they're not reading Superman? It was fine. It was a different thing. I was glad to see that they were excited about something, and that if there was a flavor that I was not as familiar with, that's fine. I'm just glad that they had something that they enjoyed also, and I maybe I can learn something about it.
I think of the title of that movie, Revenge of the Nerds, and I think of this stereotype of a nerd, which for me is a 1980s thing, but for people a little older than me, there are probably 70s and 60s and 50s nerds.
It's a hurtful word, Tim. Yeah.
So, but I mean, look at culture right now. The nerds won. Look at movies and television, right? In 2000. Squares, just regular people at my job had action figures on their desks because it was like a Kiss figure from the band Kiss, or Austin Powers, or the Yellow Submarine Beatles, right? That's a guy who publishes a comic making a toy company so he can make toys of his comics character and then making a lot of other toys. Like, that's just culture now. So,
yeah, Disney became the most powerful media giant that the world has ever known because they bought Star Wars and Marvel Comics. I mean, really, if you look at it, it's like that's what allowed that to happen. I mean, there were other steps along the way, but
Yeah.
I mean, that was what did it. And that's, that's not just a niche thing. That's media. That's everything. That we're all soaking in it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Speaking of big companies and such, so here's a question. Is there anything that the big companies are really pushing right now, but which the fans just aren't responding to? That's not really selling?
The Inhumans, but that's kind of ending now. No, it's true. There was a because Marvel didn't have the movie rights to Marvel and Disney did not have the movie rights to the X-Men. Within the comics, they tried to sort of push the Inhumans, which are another group of characters with special powers. They sort of tried to push them as kind of the replacement X-Men and replacement mutants, and it just didn't take. It just didn't happen. And now they're kind of de-escalating from that. But for a few years, there was a lot of Inhuman stuff that nobody went for.
There have been all these series and miniseries for the last 2 years, and it seems to be wrapping up. But sort of is it the apex or the nadir?
the nadir is the low point. Yeah.
It's sort of a high point.
Yeah.
When the Inhumans TV show started, the first episode had a limited theatrical release.
This was fun. 2
weeks before the TV premiere in giant screens. Quote, it's not really IMAX, but IMAX, and we have store outings, all the Hub Comics employees and a +1. We go to every Marvel movie on opening night because it's fun, and also so that whoever's working the Friday and the Saturday and the Sunday doesn't get spoilers when customers come in and talk about the movie. So some of it's preventative, but we're all very excited about these movies. And that was sort of technically one of them, but we also suspected it wasn't going to be great. And we did enjoy seeing that.
It was a lot of artistic choices that were very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of your question of are there any things that the big companies are pushing that's not working? Yes, so many things all the time. But I don't say that. I don't say that in a bad way. I mean, Marvel publishes 60 to 90 comics a month, and I think 40 or 50 graphic novels a month. Maybe let's say 30. It's probably a little high. Excuse me, 30. And Fantagraphics, which has published the complete Peanuts and a bunch of Popeye. They've got and Love and Rockets, and My Favorite Thing Is Monsters, which was sort of the it book of last year. We sold a ton of My Favorite Thing Is Monsters, and out of the, let's say, 75 comics that Marvel publishes a month, 5 of them we sell a lot of. And many of them we sell 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of to just a few customers who specifically ask. But Fantagraphics publishes, I think, 10 to 15, graphic novels. They don't really do single issues, although they keep dipping their toe in that pond. But books a month, and 3 of them will really hit, and maybe a couple of them aren't a good fit for us, and we don't carry it, or we just get one, and several sort of fall in the middle, and we sort of don't worry about it, because a month later we get that new catalog, and Marvel's got another 70 issues of everything, and Fantagraphics has another 10, and that's just 2 of the publishers. So
they're right. There are a lot of things that they try. They're constantly trying a lot of things, and many of them don't work. I often say it's like baby sea turtles. They just lay a lot of eggs, and then it's up to them if they can make it to the ocean. And some of them never do.
I have been saying this I've been saying this for 7 years as a retailer, and I've been thinking it for 20 years as a reader, and I learned this from other retailers, from people who owned and managed and worked in comic book stores. The publishers are publishing too much, right? Do you like Spider-Man? Well, here's 4 monthly Spider-Mans. And then you say, Tim, there's only 2 monthly Spider-Mans. Well, but there's also a miniseries, and the moment that's over, there'll be another one. And also, he's showing up in this other book, and then in 6 months, there'll be a crossover. and there'll be 6 Spider-Man specials published in 2 months to add additional story to the crossover. And if there was really only one monthly X-Men comic, not 6, Wolverine Old, Wolverine Young, Wolverine's Clone, X-Men Red, X-Men Black, X-Men Blue, X-Men Gold, the Multiple Man miniseries. I'm just talking about this month until 3 months from now. If there was one monthly X-Men comic and it was really good, we could sell not only a lot of that, we could sell collectively more of that than all the others combined.
Yes.
Now, maybe not every store could say that, and I think Marvel's calculus is that is not true, that it is worth it to produce a lot, or in my view, overproduce. But I think part of what they're doing is burning out a lot of readers. People say, "Oh, I don't read comics anymore. I run out of space," or "Oh, they're too expensive," or "I only read digital because I don't have space in my apartment for all the books."
Remember, we were talking about Spider-Man, because Spider-Man, everybody knows Spider-Man. Most people like Spider-Man. There have been how many Spider-Man #1? How many times have they relaunched Spider-Man in the last 5 years, Tim? It's been
3 plus Superior when Peter sort of died and a villain became Spider-Man.
And each one of these has had, for us anyway, diminishing sales returns, because each time you can't. This has been a strategy for a while with the big 2 publishers, Marvel and DC, where they will launch a book for a while, cancel it, and relaunch it with a new #1. And the problem with that is it creates a temporary sales bump, but every time you cancel something, people jump off. When you take and when you take it away, people don't know it's we used to sell a lot more. We still sell a good number of Ms. Marvel. When they canceled it for the Secret Wars miniseries, where they canceled every one of their titles and relaunched it, a lot of people didn't know it was coming back. We lost a lot of readers simply because they thought, well, that's the end of because they weren't traditional readers. They didn't understand this cycle of
and for those first 4 or 5 or 6 months where Miss Marvel came back, and it was now issue 1, issue 2, issue 3 of the second series, which just continued her story. She didn't die, right? I mean, the universe ended in Secret Wars, but
then it just came back.
If you were only reading Miss Marvel, it did not matter that the universe ended and then came back. It's just what she did next. Now we had a new issue 1 and a new issue 2 and a new issue 3, and someone would come in the store and they'd see issue 3 and they'd say, "Oh, great, issue 3. I missed that when it came out. Oh, sorry, that's the new issue 3. That's actually different than the old issue 3. This is really issue 23 or whatever the number would be if you combined the two." And
and that is confusing.
Imagine if you have 1960s Star Trek with William Shatner, and then you have the J.J. Abrams cinematic universe with Chris Pine. Imagine if Paramount did that every 3 years. Imagine if they just recast Captain Kirk and all the crew of the Enterprise, and it was a movie or a TV show or web series.
Have you seen Star Trek 2? Well, which one?
Right. I mean, you would get frustrated and confused, and you might not like Star Trek anymore. And there was a new Amazing Spider-Man #1 because the previous series got to a huge climactic event, and the writer had been there for years, and he left, and it was actually going to be issue 802 because the series has been running for decades, and Marvel's calculus is that an issue #1 is going to sell better than an issue number 10 or an issue number 802. And so they ended the series and started a new series called Amazing Spider-Man, and it's got a giant issue #1 on it. And we didn't order that many copies because 2 years ago there was a new Amazing Spider-Man #1, and 2 years before that there was a Superior Spider-Man #1, and I think I'm forgetting one in there. And people didn't come in and say, "Do you have the new Amazing Spider-Man #1?" They just sort of walked by it and went and bought Mouse or Persepolis or asked about, I don't know, the famous Spider-Man story from 5 years ago, which we have in a graphic novel collection.
And this isn't a knock on the quality of any of these books, just in there's sort of
the publishing plan of them.
Yes.
The writers and artists.
Mm-hmm.
It's great stuff. But it's hard to juggle.
Yeah.
It must be hard for you guys too, because you don't really know what to carry, do you? Half the time, you're not sure what's going to win and what's not, and it's going to cost you a lot of money if you gamble wrong.
It is a guessing game, but if you're at a store, you pay attention and you listen to customers and you rely on your evergreens and you make it work. Jesse's gonna Jesse's gonna head out. Do you guys want to ask one wrap-up question or jump to a wrap-up thought, and we'll end this?
Well, actually, I'll have one, and then Don will have one if you don't mind. Very quickly, so Marvel and DC are both launching digital online comic services. I've heard effectively kind of their Netflix for comics models and such. Do you think that this is going to affect you and the industry in the future?
That's hard to say. I don't think so. Both publishers have had digital comics subscription services for the last 5 or 7 years, and the sales figures that we have heard recently and even 4 or 5 years ago were that digital sales, people reading comics on their tablets or computers, was a drop in the bucket compared to buying issues, buying books.
Right.
As these things get bundled with sort of internet, cable TV stations that also have TV shows, as your computer and your TV all become the same thing, I don't know. That's a kind of entertainment consumption that is strange and mysterious to me. But I think that people love books, and screens are great. I mean, being able to get anything in my pocket, I can tap a button and a day later someone brings me chocolate milk. That's amazing. But when you read a book on your screen, every book is the same size, and
True.
you can't appreciate what the printing and the paper and the color look like because it's on your screen, and you can't close it, and it's not an object. It's not a gorgeous object in your hands that's on your shelf. It's the same screen that you read the news on, and you did a Skype interview on, and you Facebooked on. I think books are special, and people want books.
And the thing I keep saying is that unlike other industries that have been disrupted by digital delivery, like videos, books, prose books, and music, books and music, you're getting pretty much the same thing. With a comic book, the medium is the message. The comic book as an object is a different thing than you see it on a screen. If you're seeing it on the screen, it's not the same. I think people like to hold it in their hand. They like the tangible object more than they do like a regular book. You can read it digitally. It's sort of, the information is the same, but comics, it's the paper, it's the physicality of turning a page. Are digital comics going to change things? Absolutely. Are they going to replace actual physical comics? I don't think so, because they haven't yet, and I feel like they could have by now. And I think people still like to browse, they like to hold comics in their hands.
Okay, Don, any final thought before we go, or question?
Well, I got two kind of quickity points here. Number one is I can understand people being confused by the new numbering thing, because recently DC went back to the old numbering. So imagine being the poor schmo who came in last month, bought Superman 52, and then comes in this month and they're already up to 1007. Like, that would be a shock. And then it's interesting to hear how you talk about how you've got your store set up and the attitude you have, because it reminds me back like when I was a kid in the early 80s, when you had the comic shop boom and you had the comic industry explode because of it, because all of a sudden there was a way to get books that other people who didn't care for superheroes would read. Like, that was the mainstream. And it's nice to hear that somebody's still doing that you're taking into account bringing new readers in, and not just bringing them into whatever's established, but letting them find their own thing and kind of rolling with wherever the industry goes. Like, I wish more places would I wish more industries would do that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We think of ourselves, we're not just selling books, we're we're trying to convert people because books
and it sounds like you're doing a good job of it too.
Books and stories are important. People want stories.
Yep, and I think that's an excellent point to end on. So thank you, Tim, and thank you, Jesse, for coming on the show. We really appreciate this. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you so much.
Yep. And if any of you are in the Somerville area or the Boston area, please go and check out Hub Comics. They're awesome people and have some great books that you would love to read.
If you listeners do come to the store, tell us that you heard this interview, because then we would know that we made a connection with you before, and we'd love to meet you in person.
Awesome. So thanks again, guys, and to our listeners, good night. God bless. Talk to you later. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya!